Welcome to Crime Documentary, the channel where we uncover the darkest truths hidden behind closed doors. Tonight, we bring you a chilling case that shattered the silence of one of America's most private communities, the Amish. Known for their simplicity, faith, and peaceful way of life, the Amish are rarely associated with violence or crime. But when blood was spilled in their quiet farmland, the entire nation turned its eyes toward them in disbelief. This wasn't just another crime. It was an act so shocking, so brutal, that it ripped through the innocence of a culture untouched by the outside world. It began on a crisp autumn morning in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The air carried a sharp chill, and the faint smell of wood smoke drifted across the fields from the farmhouses that dotted the landscape. The fields stretched wide and golden under the fading warmth of October sun, and the sound of horses' hooves against gravel roads echoed like a rhythm of life unbroken for centuries. This was the heart of Amish country, where technology seemed like another world away, and the days moved slowly with the rising and setting of the sun. The one-room schoolhouse, tucked neatly between barns and cornfields, looked ordinary in every sense. Small wooden walls painted white, a tall iron bell on the roof, and a single flag flapping lightly in the breeze. Children, in plain dresses and straw hats, filed inside, their laughter light and innocent as they prepared for another day of lessons there. Voices rising like birdsong in the morning stillness. For the Amish community, routine was sacred. Life unfolded in patterns of faith, humility, and workdays began early with chores that had been the same for generations: milking cows, tending to crops, preparing meals from scratch in homes that had no electricity, no television, no distractions from the outside world. It was a way of life built on separation from modernity and closeness to God and family. The one-room schoolhouse was not only a place of learning but a symbol of their simplicity, a room filled with wooden desks, slates, chalkboards, and oil lamps. Its walls adorned not with posters of pop culture, but with scripture verses and hand-drawn charts of letters and numbers inside. On that morning, the children settled in while their teacher prepared lessons in reading, arithmetic, and scripture. They had no reason to suspect that the peace of their world was about to collapse. Down the road, a man drove slowly, his eyes fixed ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. His name was Charles Roberts, a man who had grown up in the area, who knew the Amish well, not because he was one of them, but because he drove a milk truck that collected milk from Amish farms. He had spoken to them, shared moments of neighborly connection, exchanged greetings on quiet mornings when the world seemed kind and ordinary, yet inside him a storm had been brewing for years. Grief and anger had twisted his soul into something dark. He had suffered the loss of his infant daughter years before, and though time had passed, the wound had never healed. Instead, it had festered. Roberts carried bitterness against God, blaming him for his pain, and in the deepest corners of his heart, resentment began to take shape until it grew into something unbearable. That morning, Roberts was not on his usual route. He carried with him more than tools of his trade. Inside his truck, he had weapons, ammunition, chains, and supplies, all signs that this was not a random act but a plan meticulously shaped in the shadows of his mind. He had chosen his target carefully, a place where innocence lived, a place that reflected everything he had lost and everything he believed God had denied him. The schoolhouse stood quietly in the distance as he approached, its modest form blending into the farmland as if it were part of the earth itself. Yet to Roberts, it looked like a stage waiting for a script of terror. He stopped the truck nearby, his heart pounding, his breath uneven, his thoughts a tangle of fury and sorrow. The children inside the schoolhouse were already engaged in their morning prayers when the door creaked open, and Roberts stepped in. His presence was strange, even alarming. Though the Amish were accustomed to outsiders, their world was rarely intruded upon in such a sudden way. His eyes were hard, his voice sharp as he addressed the teacher and the students. What began as confusion quickly turned into fear as he ordered the adults and the boys to leave, leaving behind only the girls. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the quickened breathing of children who did not yet fully understand the danger that surrounded them. Outside, the autumn wind rustled through the corn stalks while a horse grazed lazily in a nearby field. The peaceful scene stood in eerie contrast to the horror unfolding inside. Robert spoke in broken tones about his anger, about his life, about the darkness that consumed him. His words made little sense to the children, who stared at him wide-eyed and trembling. Their teacher tried to reason with him, tried to calm his spirit, but he was beyond persuasion. Years of hidden rage had led him to this moment, and no voice of reason could turn him away from it. In those first minutes, the Amish children clung to one another. Some whispered prayers in Pennsylvania Dutch, their dialect, their small voices barely audible. Roberts moved with tense determination, blocking the doors, preparing his cruel plan, while the teacher, who had been sent outside, rushed for help, her heart racing as she realized what was happening. Neighbors were alerted. Phones rang in houses that normally remained untouched by such noise. Within moments, the quiet countryside was alive with urgency, yet inside the schoolhouse time seemed suspended, each second stretching into eternity as Roberts tightened his grip on the little room and its helpless captives. Schoolhouse itself bore witness to the transformation. From sanctuary to prison, its wooden walls that had absorbed generations of laughter and learning now absorbed fear. The desks once used for lessons became barriers. The chalkboard, once filled with gentle words of teaching, stood as a silent backdrop to violence. The children's handmade lunch pails, lined neatly against the wall, seemed suddenly out of place, reminders of the innocence of the day before. Robert's thoughts flickered between the past and the present, his lost child, his grievances, his fury at God. He spoke of revenge, he spoke of pain, he spoke of the injustices he believed life had handed him. To the Amish children, his words were foreign, incomprehensible. They could not understand why this man would bring such anger into their small world. They could only cling to their faith, whispering prayers that reached higher than the ceiling of that room, prayers that carried into the heavens even as despair settled over them. Fields outside remained golden. The sunlight fell gently on the land, and the sound of distant farm work continued as though nothing was wrong. Yet behind those wooden walls, something unspeakable was taking root, a crime that would travel beyond the fields, beyond Pennsylvania, into the headlines of the nation, a crime that would shatter the image of Amish innocence for all who heard of it, and for those inside the schoolhouse. The world as they had known it was ending, replaced by terror, by confusion, by the weight of a man's vengeance that they could neither explain nor escape. Roberts ordered the boys and the adults to leave, and his voice carried a weight that froze the air inside the room. The children's small bodies stiffened as they realized they were being separated one by one. Their teacher guided the boys toward the door, their faces pale and eyes wide, as they glanced back at their sisters, who remained behind. Their feet shuffled reluctantly across the wooden floor, as if some part of them knew they should resist, but their fear was stronger. The boys stepped outside into the bright autumn morning, where the silence of the fields felt strangely suffocating behind them. The heavy sound of the schoolhouse door shutting echoed like the sealing of fate inside the room. Only the girls remained, their dresses in shades of blue, gray, and black, their white bonnets trembling slightly as their heads turned from one another to the figure who now stood in command. Roberts moved with an unsettling calm, as if his rage had been rehearsed for years. He pulled items from the bags he had carried into the room, lengths of rope chains, rolls of duct tape, and the cold metallic glint of weapons. The children did not know the language of violence. They knew chores, prayers, scripture, but not the mechanics of destruction. Yet instinctively they understood this man's intent was unlike anything they had ever imagined. Their breaths grew faster. Their small hands tightened together as they sat clustered near the front desks. The room that had once been a sanctuary of learning was transformed before their eyes into a cage. Roberts methodically blocked the doors, reinforced the windows, and created barriers. His actions, deliberate and chilling. Outside, word spread quickly. Neighbors rushed from farm to farm, warning each other of the nightmare unfolding in the schoolhouse. Telephones, though absent in Amish homes, rang in the houses of nearby English families, who immediately contacted authorities. It did not take long for police to arrive, their cars crunching against the gravel roads, their sirens muted by the expanse of farmland. Officers moved swiftly but cautiously, setting up a perimeter around the school. The Amish stood quietly nearby, their faces etched with shock, their hands clasped tightly in prayer. Their community, unused to modern violence, now found itself the focus of a spectacle they had only read about in newspapers. Inside, Roberts paced the narrow aisles between desks, the weight of his words pressing down on the children. He spoke of his daughter who had died years earlier. He spoke of his anger toward God. He spoke of his intent to make others feel the pain he had carried within him. He demanded obedience in silence. The girls sat trembling, their eyes glistening with tears. Some too young to fully grasp what was happening, yet old enough to sense the darkness settling over them. Their prayers whispered in Pennsylvania Dutch were soft like the rustle of leaves outside. Roberts listened, but his heart was deaf to their innocence. He was consumed by a storm that had been building for years. Police negotiators set up outside, their voices carried through loudspeakers, pleading with Roberts to let the children go, offering him a chance to surrender, offering him a path away from bloodshed. But Roberts' voice, when he answered, was unyielding, his words sharp with resentment. He refused their appeals, his anger spilling out in declarations of revenge, his voice rising and falling in tones that left officers fearing. Time was slipping away. Each second inside the schoolhouse became heavier. The distance between the negotiators and Roberts measured not in yards but in the fragile breaths of the children whose lives hung in balance. The Amish parents stood in clusters. Nearby, some had already lost sons and daughters in the separation, their hearts torn between relief and anguish, relief that their sons had escaped, anguish that their daughters remained trapped inside. Their faith taught them submission to God's will and forgiveness, even in the face of pain, yet no faith could erase the raw terror of hearing gunshots or the thought of their children being harmed. They prayed fervently, their voices hushed but constant, as if their prayers could form a shield around the schoolhouse, as if their words could soften the heart of the man who held their daughters hostage. Inside, Robert's movements grew more erratic. He lined the girls against the chalkboard, their small figures standing in contrast to the dark shadow he cast upon them. He spoke to them in fragments of confession, admitting the torment of his past, admitting the rage that consumed him, yet never showing mercy. His eyes hardened each time the negotiator spoke, his hands gripping the weapon more tightly as though the weight of it steadied him. The children continued to pray, whispering the words of faith that had been taught to them since birth. Jesus, be near us. God, protect us. Forgive those who hurt us. Their voices trembled, but they did not stop. Robert's face twitched as though their prayers unsettled him. Yet he pressed forward, driven by a darkness that refused to yield. Negotiators tried to buy time, offering Roberts food, offering him phone calls, offering him anything that might delay the inevitable, but he resisted each attempt. His words filled with bitterness. He spoke of life's cruelty, of God's silence, of his desire to make others suffer as he had suffered. The officers listening outside exchanged anxious glances, knowing his intent was clear and his resolve firm. The Amish fathers standing nearby lowered their heads, tears slipping silently down their faces, their prayers rising in the still autumn air. The minutes passed like hours. The golden light of the fields dimmed as the afternoon deepened, and shadows lengthened across the schoolhouse walls. Inside, the tension grew unbearable. The children's bodies stiff from sitting, their hearts pounding with every sound. Robert's anger rose in waves, his voice sometimes breaking, as if grief momentarily cracked through the shell of rage. But each time he steadied himself with grim determination, his plan unfolding exactly as he had designed it. Then, without warning, the sound of gunfire tore through the air, sharp and violent. It echoed across the fields like thunder. The officers outside reacted, instantly scrambling forward as chaos erupted. The Amish parents clutched one another, some collapsing to the ground, their prayers turning into cries of anguish. The negotiators shouted desperately over the loudspeakers, but the silence that followed was deafening. The children inside had no escape, only the strength of their faith, their whispered prayers still lingering in the corners of the room even as the echoes of gunshots faded into the still autumn air. When the police finally stormed the schoolhouse, the world inside was nothing like the quiet wooden room they had known before. The floor that had once carried the footsteps of children, shuffling to their desks, now carried the weight of bodies. Lying motionless, the smell of gunpowder filled the air, heavy and suffocating, mingling with the faint scent of chalk and wood. Roberts had unleashed his fury in the most devastating way, his gunfire leaving behind a scene too terrible for the mind to easily hold. Officers moving quickly through the doorway were struck by the sight of young girls dressed in simple Amish clothing, some still breathing in shallow gasps, others already still, their small hands smeared with blood. The chalkboard behind them bore the innocent marks of arithmetic from earlier lessons, numbers and letters scrawled across its surface, now serving as a silent witness to tragedy. The key. Officers' voices rang out commands to secure the scene, shouts to bring in medics, pleas for stretchers and ambulances to move faster. They stepped carefully but urgently, weaving through the chaos, their eyes forced to absorb details that would haunt them long after they left the schoolhouse. Roberts himself lay slumped on the ground, his weapon near his body. He had turned the gun on himself, ending his life in the same place where he had taken the lives of children, his rage consuming him until the very last second, his story sealed with a single violent act that ensured there would be no courtroom, no trial, only questions that would never receive answers. The medics rushed in, carrying bags and equipment, kneeling beside the small figures lined across the floor, their voices quick and clipped as they worked to find pulses, to stop bleeding, to breathe life into lungs that had been silenced. The sight of such innocence broken shook even the most experienced among them. Some of the girls responded faintly, their breaths shallow, their eyes fluttering open with confusion, their small voices whispering prayers, even in their pain. Others did not move, their stillness echoing louder than the sirens that now filled the fields outside. The one-room schoolhouse had transformed into a place of grief, its silence heavy and unbearable, broken only by the hurried commands of rescue workers. Outside, families waited, their hearts pounding, their hands gripping one another as they searched the faces of officers and medics for signs of hope. Fathers stood with heads bowed, mothers clutched the arms of neighbors. The Amish community, known for its calmness, stood in hushed desperation, their prayers constant, their faith tested in a way they had never imagined. They watched as stretchers were carried out one by one, their daughters placed gently upon them, some with eyes closed, some with faint movements that signaled life. Their parents followed quietly, their grief concealed not in screams but in trembling silence, their way of enduring pain deeply rooted in faith and submission. News of the tragedy spread rapidly. Television crews rushed to the scene, reporters struggling to find words that could capture the horror of what had taken place. America tuned in, unable to comprehend how such violence could touch one of its most peaceful communities. The image of Amish children carried from a schoolhouse into ambulances etched itself into the nation's memory. Within hours, the story dominated headlines, the words Amish and massacre placed side by side in ways no one had ever expected. The peaceful farmland of Lancaster County became the center of attention for a grieving nation. Investigators entered the schoolhouse, carefully photographing the scene, collecting evidence, documenting every detail of Robert's preparations, the weapons, the chains, the notes he had left behind. His writings revealed fragments of his mind consumed by grief and anger, letters filled with confessions of his torment, his bitterness toward God, his decision to take revenge against innocence itself. Investigators pieced together a portrait of a man broken by loss, a man who allowed his despair to rot into vengeance. Yet, for all the evidence gathered, no explanation could truly satisfy the question that lingered in every heart: why the Amish, why children, why a people who had never harmed him? The more investigators studied the case, the more the senselessness of it all became apparent. Amish themselves did not dwell on those questions in the same way. Their response was rooted in faith. Their first words were not about revenge or justice, but about forgiveness. Even as their daughters lay in hospitals, some fighting for life even as fresh graves were dug in quiet cemeteries. They spoke of releasing anger, of offering compassion to the family of the man who had brought them so much pain. It was a response that stunned outsiders, who could not understand how forgiveness could come so swiftly. Yet for the Amish, it was not a choice, but a command of their faith to forgive, even when the heart breaks, to trust that God's will is beyond human comprehension. Their actions revealed a strength that baffled the modern world. In the days that followed, funerals were held in quiet Amish cemeteries. Horse-drawn buggies lined the roads as communities gathered to mourn the girls who had been lost. Their small coffins, carried gently by hands that trembled but did not resist. The Amish did not allow cameras into their ceremonies. Their grief was private, yet the world still watched from the edges. Reporters describing the simple hymns, the plain wooden markers, the dignity with which the families carried their sorrow. Neighbors from outside the Amish community came in droves, offering condolences, donations, food, anything that could ease the weight of tragedy. The bond between the Amish and the English grew unexpectedly strong, forged in the fire of shared grief. The Roberts family too became a part of the story. His widow, left behind with children of her own, struggled to understand the man she had known, the man who had kissed her goodbye that morning, the man who had promised her a normal life. Now remembered as the architect of a massacre, she faced the judgment of outsiders, the weight of shame and grief. Yet the Amish reached out to her, not with condemnation, but with compassion. They visited her home. They embraced her family. They told her they forgave her husband. They told her they held no hatred in their hearts toward her. Their actions spoke louder than words ever could, their faith manifesting in grace that transcended human instinct. To cross America, conversations unfolded about faith, forgiveness, grief, and violence. Psychologists spoke of the burden of untreated trauma, of the dangers of hidden rage. Sociologists spoke of the contrast between modern society's thirst for vengeance and the Amish embrace of peace. The story became more than a tragedy. It became a mirror reflecting the darkest and brightest aspects of human nature. The violence of one man set against the grace of a community who chose to forgive. The nation found itself captivated not only by the horror of the crime, but by the extraordinary response that followed. Yet, for the families of the girls who died, the grief lingered quietly, their homes filled with the absence of laughter, their fields echoing with memories of daughters who would never return. Though their faith guided them through their sorrow, their hearts still carried the weight of loss. Grief and forgiveness lived side by side within them, a paradox the world could hardly fathom. They carried it with quiet dignity, the same way they carried every hardship of their lives, trusting that even in the shadow of tragedy, God's presence remained. The schoolhouse itself became a symbol of both pain and resilience. Eventually, the Amish made the decision to tear it down, unable to leave it standing as a reminder of horror. In its place they planted grass, returning the land to the simplicity from which it had come. It was their way of healing, their way of reclaiming the space, not with memorials or monuments, but with silence and renewal. The land once again became part of the fields, blending into the cycle of seasons that had always defined their lives. For them it was not about remembering the violence, but about moving forward without letting bitterness take root. Years later, the memory of that day still lingers in Lancaster County, and beyond it remains a story that shocks each new listener, not only for the brutality of what was done, but for the extraordinary response that followed. The questions of why will never be fully answered, but the example of forgiveness lives on as a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable evil, the human heart is capable of choosing grace. The Amish girls, whose lives were taken, are remembered not only for the tragedy of their deaths, but for the light of faith that their community carried forward in their name. But what shocked America even more than the crime itself was the response that followed. The blood had barely dried in the schoolhouse when the first whispers of forgiveness began to rise from the Amish community. It seemed unthinkable to the outside world. Forgiveness was not the natural reaction to murder. Forgiveness was not what most people turned to when their children were taken in such a brutal way. Yet for the Amish, forgiveness was as essential as breath, and as natural as prayer. They did not forgive because it was easy. They forgave because their faith demanded it. They forgave because holding on to hatred would only poison their hearts and rob them of peace. The families of the slain girls came together in their grief, their plain clothes soaked with tears, their hands clasped in prayer. And yet when they spoke, it was not of vengeance. They spoke instead of mercy. They spoke of Robert's widow and his children left behind. They spoke of the suffering that must now rest upon his family, and they reached out to them, extending words of comfort and compassion that few outside the Amish could comprehend. Within hours of the massacre, Amish elders walked quietly to the Roberts' home, knocking on the door of the woman whose husband had destroyed their world, and instead of anger, they offered her solace. They told her they did not hold her accountable. They told her they did not want her to suffer under the weight of his sins, and they embraced her in her grief. As though she were their own neighbor. At Robert's funeral, the nation watched in disbelief. More Amish mourners attended than outsiders. They came in their black buggies, driving slowly along country roads. They entered the church with bowed heads, and they stood side by side with Robert's widow and children. The very people who should have been shunned or despised were instead surrounded with compassion. The reporters who stood at a distance tried to capture the meaning of it, tried to put into words the sight of grieving parents standing in support of the family of the man who had killed their daughters, and the images spread across America, stirring debates in living rooms and newspapers alike. What kind of faith allows such forgiveness? What kind of strength does it take to let go of hatred when grief still burns in your chest? The Amish answer was simple yet profound. They believed vengeance belonged only to God. They believed that harboring bitterness would not bring their daughters back. They believed that to heal, they must forgive. Forgiveness was not for the sake of Roberts. It was for the sake of their own souls. It was the only way to preserve peace in their hearts and in their community. The outside world struggled with this. Many could not understand. Many even criticized it, calling it naive or unrealistic. Yet for the Amish, it was the only path they could walk, because their lives were built upon the teachings of Christ, who called them to love their enemies and bless those who persecuted them. In the days that followed, as funerals were held for the slain children, the simplicity of the ceremonies spoke volumes. There were no elaborate displays, no ornate coffins, no television cameras allowed. Only hymns sung in soft voices, only prayers spoken in tears, only wooden markers placed gently in the earth. And yet their quiet grief echoed louder than any broadcast. It reminded the world that sometimes the most powerful messages are not spoken in anger or shouted in protest, but whispered in forgiveness. The Amish chose to carry their pain with dignity, and in doing so they taught a lesson that reverberated far beyond their farmlands. For Robert's widow, the forgiveness of the Amish became her lifeline. She later said that their compassion had kept her from falling into despair. She expected hatred, she expected blame, she expected to be isolated, yet instead she was embraced. Her children were not treated as outcasts, they were welcomed into the arms of those who had lost their own, and this grace allowed her to survive the unbearable. It allowed her to rebuild her life in the shadow of her husband's actions. The Amish did not erase her grief, but they gave her the strength to endure it. Across America, the story sparked conversations in churches, classrooms, and families. Could forgiveness truly heal wounds this deep? Could mercy replace the need for justice? Some felt inspired, some felt challenged, others felt unsettled by the very idea that forgiveness could be offered so quickly and so freely. Yet the story remained a beacon, shining light into a culture often consumed by vengeance and retribution. It reminded people that another way was possible, even a few could walk it as faithfully as the Amish had. Over time, as the media faded and the cameras left Lancaster County, the Amish community quietly rebuilt their lives. The schoolhouse where the tragedy had unfolded was torn down, its walls dismantled, piece by piece, until nothing remained but open land. The decision was not born of denial, but of healing. They could not allow the building to stand as a monument to violence. They wanted the land to return to silence and simplicity. Grass grew where The wooden walls once stood, and in time the memory of the schoolhouse became part of the soil itself, a place of tragedy, transformed into a place of peace. Yet the story of what happened did not fade for the world outside. It became a lasting symbol. Not only of violence but of forgiveness. Books were written, documentaries filmed, sermons preached around the story of Amish grace. It became more than a crime. It became a parable, a living testimony to the strength of faith in the face of unspeakable evil. For those who studied it, the details of Robert's pain and his violent choices were haunting, but it was the Amish response that endured it. Was their forgiveness that turned the story into something greater than tragedy. It became a mirror, reflecting the possibility of light in the darkest places. Even years later, the families of the slain girls continued to live with quiet dignity, their grief never erased but carried alongside their faith. When they were asked how they could forgive, they often answered simply, because we must, because it is what God commands, because hate is a burden too heavy to bear. And in their voices, the world heard not weakness but strength, not surrender but courage. For forgiveness did not mean they had forgotten. It did not mean they no longer felt pain. It meant they had chosen not to let the pain destroy them. The Amish crime that shocked America remains one of the most haunting stories in modern history. It began with a man's unbearable grief, twisted into violence. It shattered the innocence of a community known for peace. It broke the hearts of families who had lived quietly apart from the noise of the world. Yet it ended with a response so radical that it stunned a nation. Forgiveness that defied instinct, compassion that overcame anger, grace that turned tragedy into testimony. It is remembered not only for the horror that unfolded inside a schoolhouse, but for the extraordinary light that followed, a light that continues to challenge and inspire, reminding us that even in the darkest of crimes the human spirit can rise with unimaginable strength. And so the story ends not with vengeance, not with hatred, but with forgiveness that left its mark on history and proved that even in the face of unimaginable suffering, mercy has the power to heal.